Hi there, Dr. Matthew J. Traum here. This lecture is going to cover purchase orders, what they are, how to fill one out in the context of the capstone course. We are still in the down selection to preliminary design module, but we are moving into the final design module, and purchase orders is one of the topics that kind of straddles those two modules. So we'll talk more about that as we move into the presentation. Um, you know by now, having watched a number of these videos, that the way that I operate is to time myself for 15 minutes and then stop and give you a break. And if I have slides left after that initial 15-minute period, we'll just do another 15-minute session, and we'll continue that way until the slide deck is exhausted. So you guys will get a break every 15 minutes or so when my timer runs out there. So here's the outline for the lecture today. We're going to talk about where purchase orders fit in our design process. Um, we're going to describe the difference between bill of materials, BOMs, and purchase orders, POs. We're going to talk through a purchase order completion example. So I'm going to give you just a simple product and show you the OTS parts, the modified OTS parts, and the custom parts, and then how those break out and are listed in the purchase order. And then finally, I will walk through a part finding example to show you how to collect the information that you need to fill out a purchase order for a part. Okay, so quickly we're going to talk about where purchase orders fit in the overall design process. You've seen this chart before, but just as a reminder, these are the 20 steps in the formal engineering design process that we step through in MEC 2 and MEC 3. The green dotted line is the separation between the two courses. MEC 2 is on the top, MEC 3 is on the bottom. And so we do the first 11 steps out of this 20-step process in MEC 2. And by now, you guys have marched through all of these different steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and are probably working either on the preliminary design report and or the final design report. And so you're in either preliminary design working on an initial PO or the detailed design working on a final PO for the final design report. So that's where what we're talking about in this lecture fits into this overall process. You're essentially developing a purchase order either for the preliminary design report or the final design report, and are right in the last few weeks probably of the course. Okay. So next thing I want to talk about is what is a bill of materials versus a purchase order. And I have a couple of definitions here. So let's start with an engineering bill of materials, which is a list of parts, subassemblies, and quantities of each needed to assemble a product. The bill of materials is a means of manufacturing communication and record keeping. By contrast, a purchase order, or PO, is a document set by a product design engineer who is the buyer, either internally to a company's purchasing office or externally to a supplier, which is the seller, to request materials, products, and services. And even though the analogy is not perfect, I think a good way of looking at this is a BOM, a bill of materials, is analogous to the ingredients in a cooking recipe, right? Everything is already kind of finished and finalized. And, okay, maybe you got to do a couple things like chop things up and so forth. But ultimately, those are tantamount to the assembly steps of putting together the components to make the recipe. Whereas a purchase order is analogous to a shopping list. So if you're thinking about what it is that you need to actually cook the meal, a purchase order is the shopping list that you would put together to go out to the supermarket and buy those things. So they are very slightly different. And I should probably also just explain quickly. Up until 2020, all that we asked for in MEC 2 was a bill of materials. We did not request a purchase order. And what ended up happening, at least from my perspective, is that students didn't get any experience actually figuring out where they would have to go out into the world to find the raw materials to build the parts. And in talking with the other design faculty, that type of experience, the actually going out and finding the raw materials, at least if you work in a big company, is typically done by a purchasing department. And so all that would need to happen is a design engineer would just need to submit a bill of materials, and folks in the purchasing department would essentially figure out how to convert the bill of materials into the raw materials needed to make those parts, create a purchase order, and then go out to various suppliers to find those materials. My experience is very different. I have, for the most part, worked at small, usually startup type companies, where the engineers at those companies, myself included, basically had to do everything, right? We didn't have a purchasing department because sometimes these companies only had 2 or 3 employees. And so I would actually have to take the bill of materials myself and convert it into a list of basically raw materials needed to build the parts, build out the purchase order, identify the suppliers, negotiate the cost of the parts, buy the stuff myself, bring it, quality check it when it arrived to make sure that what I had ordered was the right thing, and then take the parts, start to take the raw materials and start transforming them into the parts that ultimately landed on the bill of materials. So I felt, given my own experience working at smaller companies, that it was important to add this purchase order component to the class, so that you guys get the experience both of producing a bill of materials, which you would do in any engineering design situation, and putting together from the bill of materials a purchase order for the raw materials needed to make the parts, which is more consistent with what you would do if you were an engineer at a smaller company or a startup company and there wasn't some big purchasing office to do that job for you. So anyway, that's why we have both of these separate documents, and what differentiates them, at least in my experience, in terms of the type of companies that you would work at, and you would have to do one versus both. So, okay, let's move on. We have templates for you that we'd like you to use. And of course, these templates are a little bit selfish in that they're easy for us to use because ultimately the design faculty and the teaching staff are the purchasing department for all intents and purposes, right? We actually have to generate purchase orders that we send to the department, and the department then orders the parts, and they come to the design lab, and that's how you get the parts and the materials that will ultimately use for you guys to build your prototypes. But we want to keep these purchase orders as simple as possible. So we don't want to be like copy and pasting stuff from the documents you guys provide into the official documents that we then send to the department. So this is more or less a purchase order that would be sent to the mechanical and aerospace engineering department headquarters, to request that headquarters requisition folks buy something for us for the class. And I'll describe when we talk about this in detail, kind of, what all these cells are and what the columns are and so forth. But this is different from a bill of materials, and we also have a template for you for the capstone bill of materials, in that all that the bill of materials accounts for is the finished parts, right? It's basically a list of all the finished parts, whereas the purchase order is a list of all of the materials that you need to make those finished parts that appear in the bill of materials. So the way that this would typically go is you would start by generating the bill of materials, right? You take your CAD model, each individual part in your CAD model has its own entry in the bill of materials template. So you build up a bill of materials for your subassembly, and then take the subassembly bills of materials and use them to create an overall product, ultimate product bill of materials. And then from the bill of materials, you figure out what all those parts are, which ones can be purchased OTS, off the shelf, which ones can be OTS but require some sort of modification, and then which parts have to be basically fabricated either in-house at the university or outsourced. So that's kind of the order in which things go, and these are the two templates that kind of facilitate those two processes. But ultimately, you want to start with the bill of materials and then convert what you have there into the list of stuff that you need to put on the purchase order. Okay, so let's move on. We're going to walk through a purchase order completion example, just to kind of show you guys, how you would fill this thing out when you are thinking about how a product is actually created and what the materials are that are needed to do that. And I am going to bring in my old friend, the Pencil Top Focus toy. You guys might remember this from the Boothroyd and Dewhurst assembly time lectures. But this is the example product that I'm going to use to populate the purchase order. This is a product that a company that I founded called Engineer Inc. Used to manufacture. And it's very, very simple, but it's meant for like K through 12 students. The idea ultimately was to create a focus toy, so like a fidget toy that could sit on top of a pencil and effectively hide in plain sight. And the benefit for that is students, particularly students with learning differences, attention deficit disorder, and so forth. Studies show that if they actually have something to manipulate with their hands, it helps them to focus on lessons that are ongoing in a classroom and prevents them from like touching and bothering other students. So overall, it improves the flow of whatever lesson is occurring in a classroom. So this is a product that I used to make and sell to K through 12 teachers, and just a couple images of it. But it's basically made up of four parts. There's a pencil, a nylon screw, a lock nut on the bottom to keep the whole thing from falling apart, and then what I call the fidget nut, which is just a square, a rectangular piece of aluminum with a threaded hole that drills through it, and the fidget nut can spin up and down on the nylon screw. So that's effectively what it is. Now, I mentioned that I sold these for K through 12, so elementary school, middle school, and high school. The high school students actually had to make their own, so they would get the pencils, they would get the nylon screws, they would get the nuts, and they would also get the fidget nuts. But the fidget nuts did not have holes in them; they were not threaded, and as you guys will see in a second, there are also holes in these nylon screws. Those holes weren't there either for the high school students. I would give them the appropriate drill bits, the appropriate taps, the appropriate center drills, and the expectation was that in a chemistry class or a physics class where the students had access to a drill press, they would actually manufacture the parts themselves. The elementary school or the middle school kids, they would get a version of this where the holes were drilled and everything, but the threads were not tapped into the fidget holes, and so the middle school kids could go through the process of tapping the threads and assembling. But ultimately, what you're looking at is the elementary school version of the Pencil Top Focus Kit, which is really just an assembly exercise. So the students get everything effectively finished, and their job is just to assemble it into the final product. So there are three different types of elements here. OTS parts, modified OTS parts, and custom parts. And the OTS parts, remember OTS stands for off the shelf. The OTS off the shelf parts include the pencils and the lock nuts. And we can walk through now how to kind of put those onto the purchase order by identifying what they are, figuring out how much they cost, where to get them from, and then populating the form appropriately. So let's start with the lock nut. The lock nut, by the way, that's these components here. So the lock nut is purchased on McMaster-Carr. So here's the entry on McMaster-Carr, and what you want to include in a purchase order so that the requisition office or the purchasing office can buy what you've specified is you need a description of the item to be purchased, which gets dropped in right here. You need a part number, which gets dropped in there. You need the quantity that you need purchased, which is there. The unit associated with the quantity, these happen to come in packs of 100, so it's one pack of 100. The price for 100 of them is $9.76. Shipping, I had to estimate this, but typically McMaster-Carr charges about $7.50 for shipping. And then the subtotal then is the price that I paid to buy the thing plus the shipping price, so I get $17.28. And then here I put in the vendor name, McMaster-Carr, their address, both their physical address or their mailing address and their city and state and zip code, and then a phone number so that we can contact them if we need to, and then ultimately the website from which the purchasing office can buy the part. Okay, and I'm looking at my timer, and I'm right up against 15 minutes, so I'm going to stop, give you guys a break, and we'll pick this up in the next slide, the next lecture presentation. Thanks.